The other one that, again, place-based, which works great for out of home, is legal gambling. Kansas City and physically sits between two states, right? Missouri and Kansas. Missouri legalized online gambling on December 1st. It literally spiked, and we saw millions of dollars flow into, on the Kansas City side, just billboards up and down saying like, come bet here. Literally like cross the street and it's legal.
You're listening to Media Monitor, where we break down what's happening in the media and the advertising industry and tell you what it actually means. Well, Sean, I have a goal for us this week.
Oh boy. What is said? Of course. What is your goal?
Well, you know, I love goals. And the New York Times reported that Rick Arden and Susanna Carr have been delivering news together in Western Australia on 7 News Perth since 1985. It's a Guinness World Record for the longest amount, I guess it's an amount of time of a consistent duo reporting. It's more than 10,000 broadcasts over 40 years.
That is commitment.
So what do you think? Media Monitor, 40 years from now?
Maybe it's just comp 1 year. Our goal should be, are we doing this in 1 year? That to me feels like a win.
Yeah, and I suppose with the rate of change in this industry, maybe we should account for that and translate what 40 years would be today because everything is moving so fast. But all right, if you want to go all the way down to 1 year, we can do it.
Look, I'm just saying there's a middle ground between aspirational and like tactical goals. Let's chalk up 40 to still being aspirational.
All right. I can agree to that. But I thought that is so impressive, right?
It is actually a wild number. Yeah.
40 years, but that's how they do it in Australia.
I guess so. Yeah, I mean, also to your point on like change within the medium, you're talking about like a local ad format. Running TV back in 1985 looks nothing like running TV today. Like, you know, the news format isn't wildly different, but still, like that is a crazy amount of time, crazy amount of change. So good for them. Congrats on a 40-year run. Certainly impressive. But I did want to also maybe highlight a risk to running to 40 years because I did want to air some beef that I had with you on today's pod.
Beef.
So
I started with the goal of wanting to spend more time together, and here you are airing grievances.
Just beefing. I am. And the grievance that I want to talk to is actually related to Australia. So recently had the opportunity to present at the DPAA, which is the Digital Place-Based Advertising Association. It's all about like out of home. And I shared with you the deck that I had presented. And I think it was collectively, I don't want to quote you, but I think you said meh, which hurt. It hurt, if we're being honest and putting it out there.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if I said meh, but I probably did because that sounds like me. But in my defense, I see loads of data from you, and I'm usually, blown away by the findings. And the particular segment of the data was a corner of the advertising space that I find, maybe it's location based, is underwhelming. So I just, there weren't the oohs and the ahs, but I respect the need to analyze this area. So I think we should spend some time talking about it.
We definitely should.
Out of home. Yeah. And for those less familiar, and maybe the name kind of gives it away, but out of home refers to advertising that reaches consumers in public spaces, billboards, transit shelters, digital screens, basically anything where there's a version of, advertising that's not on your computer or your phone. So that's what we're talking about here. And what was interesting, and, you'll talk more about this, is how the U.S. compares to everywhere else in the world. So let's do it, Sean. Despite my initial meh, let's deep into out of home today.
Well, not to. I am also an American, so obviously this is like, a kettle pot. But I think one of the things that, defending my own research and data, is for most Americans, when you talk about out of home, there is just a collective like, okay, a lack of interest, right? It's not cool and interesting like search or social or, even CTV streaming. And so as a result, I think that that's actually like what carried through. And that was like my takeaway of your reaction was like, it was less in defense of myself, the quality of the research, and more about like just a general attitude among Americans around what I think is an interesting medium. Because If we talk about Australia, if we talk about other countries, out of home has a wild percentage in terms of media mix. In many countries, it might be like 10% of media mix, 15% of media mix. And in most other countries, far more mature in terms of a market. An interesting stat is if you look at our data globally through all of Guideline, and you look specifically at the US is roughly in a given year around 70% of our ad spend. Obviously, when you look globally, that might be more akin to, based on most projections, like 40-ish%. So obviously we're fairly American heavy, but still, the US market is fairly representative for the global market. But when you drill into out of home specifically, the US is only 40% of our data today. So to kind of recap, 70% overall, if you look at all of the media dollars in terms of what we have visibility and line of sight into. But if we look just at out of home, the US drops to only 40% in terms of representation of the market. So on one side, right, that probably tells us that the out of home data is fairly comprehensive of what we have line of sight into. The other thing that it tells me is that the US is wildly undershared when it comes to out of home. Like the UK and China collectively are much, much bigger markets than kind of the US is. Whereas if you looked at them, in terms of total spend, China rivals the US in terms of ad spend, but like the UK is a fraction of the overall, in terms of money. So it's interesting. That was like one thing that really stood out to me is just like how mismatched the US is from a trends perspective. Usually it's like how the US trends in terms of advertising is tends to be leading as
Yeah.
than like what happens with the rest of the world. I would immediately say out of home, exact opposite. The US is wildly behind in terms of maturation, growth, even like total percent of media mix. 60% of our global markets that we kind of look at have outpaced the US since kind of post-pandemic, 2021, 2022. But overall, that's kind of the opposite trend, right? Like 60% of markets underperform relative to the US in terms of overall growth. So again, it's this consistent, like something's happening in out of home where the US collectively has gone meh. So it's not you alone. I'm not just
It's not
blaming you.
just me. Well,
It's
so
not just
what do
you.
we think is behind that? I mean, I think we talked a little bit about this when you and I were chatting, just, population density in certain areas. What other factors might be behind this?
Yeah, right. Part of what we had talked about was like geographically, the US is just a very big space with population pockets kind of all over the place. China, as a flip side, even though they are geographically pretty spread out, most of the population really resides kind of along the East Coast, essentially. So as a result, out of home is a much more effective medium to reach
Mm.
a lot of people in a short amount of time. Same thing with the UK. I can kind of put up a billboard in a few places, and I know I will effectively reach a huge chunk of, at least kind of on the British Isle, the majority of maybe, Britain's Londoners in the course of a couple of days. If I wanted to reach that same population as a percentage in the US, I've got to run like billboards in New York, Chicago, LA, maybe even some smaller markets like Miami. So it's a much tougher
Yeah. So it's all about
conversation.
ad effectiveness, right? Like
It's all about
it's
reach.
better
Yeah.
bang for your buck. That makes a ton
For
of sense.
sure. Yeah. So I would argue that that's like a big part of it. The other part is that the US has been super slow about converting over to digital out of home. That's like a big driver of growth. You look at the US is maybe 22% of overall of the market, at least in our data, is digital. You look at like China, the UK, even a lot of European markets, the percent of digital as like the percent of inventory is all above, 40% in most of these markets.
Yeah,
So,
and
like,
I
that's a big
wonder,
part of it.
is that I mean, I know as a Californian, we have laws that restrict this because so many of our times to access a billboard is while driving, and we don't wanna have distracted driving, but I bet, that people are taking public transit, they're on foot in other countries, and it's a totally different dynamic
A
with
lot more walking, yeah.
a lot more walking outside of
Yeah.
the US.
As a lot of Europeans would probably share, a lot more walking, which
Yeah.
helps on the out-of-home front.
Now, so and knowing that this is kind of one of the, like, traditional advertising forms, what does it look like? What are the trends, within the US? How is that looking today, even though
Yeah.
it's a smaller percentage?
Yeah, despite the meh kind of collectively, it is the only traditional format that we're actually expecting to grow for, 2026 overall, right? We're expecting, radio, print, all of those to kind of continue their downward decline. And then where we're seeing growth in the US market is really around kind of digital formats, which again, not wildly surprising, but, specifically to out of home, we're projecting it to grow overall by about, percent. But the interesting thing is if you break that down to that whole like digital dynamic, digital is supposed to be growing about like our forecast says about 15%, whereas like
Mhm.
traditional is just under 2%. So like the mismatch between how fast digital is growing versus just how much digital inventory there is to sell, I think is holding back the out of home industry in a way that we're not seeing in other kind of verticals, industries, et cetera. And it's one of those like interesting dynamics that play that like no matter the fact that they're still growing less than the overall pie. So like despite growth happening, they still continue to lose market share versus other formats. Despite their growth in the last, 4 years, they've lost about $1.5 billion of just market share. Like if they just like kind of kept it as is, they would be $1.5 billion richer today than they were a couple years back. And it's all just because it's just not growing that fast. And part of it is the limitation of just how many digital placements there are available.
And while we are seeing this growth, like you mentioned, it's still not growing at the clip as the international market. But
Yeah.
who's driving that growth? And I sit in a unique location because I mean everybody knows the drive from SFO up to San Francisco. All you get is like everything tech and currently AI. So I'm not seeing the broader lens of what's out there. Who are the main drivers right now?
Yeah, I would highlight two. One is kind of like a interesting call out, and then one's a fun one. I don't want to knock the industry. Maybe they're both fun. But one is kind of what we would characterize as non-health insurance. So think kind of your bundlers, like a Geico, a Progressive, the buy, home and auto or whatever. That's kind of the non-health insurance industry in terms of what we analyze. That has been growing up over, 60% in our data for out of home. And a lot of it is tied to more industry headwinds. So for the
Mm.
insurance industry, they are pulling out of specific markets because they've determined that because of things like natural disasters or other kind of components, it's just too expensive to run insurance policies in certain markets. Florida's a big one, California's a big one, and so they're just
Buyers.
pulling out wholesale. Right? They're just going, yeah, no, not for us. And so as a result, they're getting a lot more tactical of like, okay, well, we can't just do our national spots and dots anymore because we're not running policies in certain counties or in certain states. We've got to be more strategic about where we run. So like out of home is a natural fit for them to then be like, cool, here is a place where we can offer policies. This feels good from a targeting perspective. So that's like one that we've seen from an interesting
Mhm.
dynamic. The other one that again, place-based, which works great for out of home, is legal gambling. So online
Mm.
betting, DraftKings, all of that is super into out of home because it's all about like, I can only advertise in places where it's currently legal. We had a fascinating kind of double click that we saw in Kansas City in Q4. So Kansas City, for, listeners that don't know, it physically sits between two states, right? Missouri and Kansas. And you kind of have this city that kind of sits on this and kind of straddles. But what I thought was super interesting was because Missouri legalized online gambling on December 1st, it literally spiked and we saw millions of dollars flow into on the Kansas City side within Missouri, just billboards up and down saying like, come bet here, come here. And to your earlier point on
Cross the
commuting,
street.
just literally like cross the street and it's legal. You're A-okay. And like, again, coming from a guy who for years commuted between New York and New Jersey, and for a while it was just legal in New Jersey, the first thing you would be greeted on when you kind of came out of the tunnel or went over the bridge commuting home was like, all right, start placing your bets on DraftKings. Start kind
And
of,
here, I thought you were going to
and
say
it's
coming from a guy who's a huge online gambler.
nope, nope. As a statistics nerd, I always fantasize about playing the lottery or driving kind of like playing all these games, but I've never done it because like the only game that I feel like is like a little bit of skill is that whole conversation on like poker or like random chance is roulette. So like those are games where I'm like, okay, this feels reasonable, but by and large, everything else is like everywhere else I know I'm going to lose money. Statistically, it's just better for me to just take my money and hold on. So I've never done online gambling. ever.
What about a prop bet? What color's
No,
Gatorade?
no, like that doesn't excite me. I also don't really watch sports, so that's part of it. Is like there's just not it's not in my blood. I've done this probably I don't know if this is terrible to admit, but I think probably in my collective life I've done one of those like Super Bowl pools once in terms of like laying out the grid. Yeah, I'm gonna do this. Okay, my
Mhm.
numbers are 2 and like 7. That's okay. Not great. I've done it once. I won
Yeah.
$20 though.
I'm with you on that. I got banned from my office because by
Wow.
sheer coincidence, I bought one Super Bowl square and I think I signed up for fantasy, did the auto draft and I won both and they were like that she never looked at anything. She's out. And yeah, so I got kicked out. But well, okay. So I'm gonna upgrade my rating from a meh to a okay.
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see where it goes from here because I think there is opportunity and I love the targeting element of it. It makes
Yeah.
a ton of sense because like you said, with out of home, it's all about the ROI on it. Like you've
For
got to
sure.
go where you're going to get your interested and relevant eyeballs. So it makes sense.
Well, what I would say is maybe since I was able to upgrade it ever so slightly, we should leave on a positive note. And maybe my goal, since you were talking goal setting, is sometime between now and when we record next week, I bring something that maybe is better than and more like a yeah.
I think we could do that.
So that's my goal. That's my goal. I'm setting my target high. Let's see what I can cook in the next couple of days and bring it back to everyone here next week.
Oh, is that a little teaser for a segment that I've been anxious to deliver, Sean?
Could be. Could be.
All right. Well, I will let you cook.
Thanks.
And, more on that later.
More on that. Well, you have a lovely weekend.
Thanks, Sean. You too.
That's Media Monitor. Follow us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts every Wednesday for a new episode. And as always, thanks for listening.